So we're going to begin today with our evolution unit, and in doing so, I think it's best to understand the life and times of Charles Darwin, who is our father of our understanding of evolution. Wasn't the first person to come up with a theory of evolution, but is the person whose theory sticks today. Especially the more and more we understand about biology year after year, it seems to just do anything, just it's constantly supporting his theory. Born in 1809, died in 1882. Um, he sailed around the world on the HMS Beagle. He was a British nobleman of sorts. And at a young age, he actually sailed around the world and was kind of a second hand to the captain. But along the way, he kept very detailed records of all the life that he observed. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about the 1830s, 40s, something thereof. And whereas today we can watch any kind of nature show on TV, obviously that's very foreign to people back then. So he was able to see all kinds of living things, plant, animal, and otherwise, that most people in their lifetime, no matter where they lived, would never ever be able to see. He also did collect fossils um, from all over the world, small ones, even some moderate-sized ones, nonetheless. What did he notice as he was traveling around the world? He noticed that organisms always seem to be very suited for their environment. So the classic example would be a polar bear in a snowy climate, blending in, having very thick fur, but having the proper camouflage. Just as much as brown bears, for instance, would blend in with a more forested environment. But he also noticed that many similar climates throughout the world didn't have the same plants and animals. So, for instance, the dry or semi-dry and hot savanna regions of Africa had animals such as kangaroos. Why didn't they have animals such as the cheetahs who lived in the semi-arid savanna regions of Africa? All right, why, for instance, a kangaroo who lives very well in its environment couldn't live in a very similar climate in Africa? We now understand more about plate tectonics and migration, but obviously at the time that wasn't totally understood. He basically appreciated life was very diverse. That there's so many different living things out there. With each individual, each species is unique in some way, shape, or form. But just the same is that there are these striking similarities that exist between all living things. All right, so for instance, a classic example, I guess you could say, if you look at these two very distinguishable species, you can see similarities. There's the same basic plan. The eyes, nose, and mouth are in the same place. The muscle structure is somewhat similar. The bone structure is somewhat similar. I make the analogy to like a car. All cars are pretty much laid out the same, but obviously they're designed. Those fine details are designed differently. That makes them unique. And even if we look at a gorilla versus like a toucan bird, and again, right away you're probably noticing the differences, but pay attention to the similarities too. In that same basic plan, two limbs up front, two limbs in the back, spine, rib cage, eyes, nose, and mouth, in the same general locations as well. And then what he also noticed is that the fossils that he was collecting seemed to be very similar to organisms today. Now, obviously, we're nowhere nearly related to Tyrannosaurus rex, but if you look at our skeletons, there's a pelvis where there's a pelvis, there's a spine where there's a spine, rib cage where there's a rib cage. And even the skulls, albeit very different, have the eyes, nose, and mouth in the same spot. And even the limbs are have a similar structure with a big bone with parallel bones running from there. Excuse me. So at Darwin's time, most people believed that the Earth was only a few thousand years old, which is a far cry from the reality that's closer to over 4 billion years old. They believe that species today have not changed. Giraffes have always been giraffes. Elephants have always been elephants. And basically, it was Darwin's studies and his theories, or I'm sorry, before I get there, he was influenced by scientists of the time. Now, I'm not going to expect you to, by any stretch of the means, to know many of these scientists. For instance, you don't need to know James Hutton, at least for the sake of an assessment, but what James Hutton did was he proved that the Earth is a constantly changing force, that the Earth itself is always changing and has been for a long time due to internal external forces, from erosion externally to volcanoes and plate tectonics internally. Charles Lyell basically kind of took that point further and basically proved that the only way the Earth could be the way it is if the Earth was millions of years old. We know it to be obviously billions of years old, but that again was a step from what people believed at the time, because people again only believed the Earth to be only maybe a few thousand years old. Thomas Malthus, which is somebody you may talk about in your history class, he basically was more of a kind of a theorist of sorts, and his theory, and it makes sense, is that the human population can only grow so big, and eventually the human population, because it's so big, will run out of space and resources. All right, and then in doing so, it's going to increase the level of competition. So if you think about it, he's focusing on how resources and competition play a role. And then he also noticed that some organisms create thousands of offspring. Some fish will lay thousands of eggs. Some plants will drop thousands, millions of seeds. But they don't, ultimately, very few of them will manifest into something full blown, something actually living. So, in other words, for some reason, most of the offspring do not prosper. Right? It's only a select few that tend to survive into any kind of adulthood. So why do only a few survive? What is it that's allowing only a few out of those thousands to survive? All right. But again, that concept of survival got Darwin thinking. Now, the one theorist I want you to be a little bit familiar with is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he actually had a theory of evolution before Darwin did. But he believed that things did change and that they do adapt to their environment. But his reasoning is flawed. He believed that things change, organisms change, because they want to. Giraffes wanted to have long necks. Elephants wanted long tusks. So this is an example from your book. You have a crab, and you have some young impressionable crabs, and the big crab says, "Excellent! I'm going to have a big claw." And ever since then, all the smaller crabs have followed in suit and had a bigger claw too, because they want to do. And that's obviously not why crabs have larger claws. Some do, at least. He said rather that species change because they're using their body parts more or less. So, for instance, maybe a giraffe's neck is longer because it was stretching it out to try to reach those tall trees. But to the same degree, you think that humans who work out more are naturally going to have stronger children, and that's not the case. And then he also believed that organisms inherit traits acquired by their parents, and what acquired means is picked up sometime in their lifetime, and that's obviously flawed because think about if you were to get a tattoo, you're not going to hand that tattoo down to the next generation. Whereas, in his time, or at least he believed that is possible between species. So, albeit these concepts influenced Darwin, they are completely false and likewise didn't inspire Darwin outright. And in fact, Darwin's theory stands true and holds water, whereas Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's clearly doesn't. So Darwin was also inspired by agriculture. At the time, many people at least were moderate farmers in their own right. And since the beginning of human time, we've realized that some crops and some livestock have favorable traits. Some cows produce more milk. Some ears of corn produce more corn, for instance. Some potatoes are bigger. And what farmers have been doing since the beginning of time was only breeding the organisms that had the traits they wanted. So they would only scatter the seeds, like I said, from the biggest, more massive potatoes, or they would only scatter the seeds of the bigger, juicier strawberries, or they would only scatter the seeds of the bigger tomatoes, not scattering the seeds of the smaller tomatoes, or they would only breed the biggest, fattest pigs. In doing so, would have their offspring would be bigger and fatter, or in the case of a strawberry, bigger and juicier. Over time, you only breed the individuals that have the traits you want, and you don't breed the individuals that have the traits that are less desirable. That's basically what we've done with dogs. For past thousands and thousands of years, we've bred traits in dogs that we found favorable, whether they be appearance or ability. For instance, like hunting dogs or huskies, for instance, who can travel great distances and are good work dogs. That's a result of generations upon generations of breeding individuals that have the traits we want. So in time, what you start to see is the favorable traits increase and the less favorable traits decrease. Your pigs are getting fatter, your cows are producing more milk, your potatoes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This, for instance, is corn. The corn on the left is actually natural corn. The corn on the right is the corn we buy in the supermarkets. which is technically not natural. And that process of only breeding the favorable traits is artificial selection, artificial in that it's man-made. So finally, Darwin, in 1859, roughly at the age of 50, published his book, The Origin of Species, which really did change our perspective on life. And he argued the following, is that species have been changing for millions of years. He argued that there is, within any species, variation. Now, you look at this small pack of wolves here, and yeah, obviously they do look similar, but some wolves are bigger, some wolves are thinner, some wolves are taller. So they have different color patterns. Some can perhaps hear better, see better. Some are probably stronger, smarter. There's variation in any species. And that variation is passed down from generation to generation. So, I use, for instance, the example of the Lion King. Mufasa passed down his wonderful traits to his son. Sadly, not before he met his demise. And his son inherited a lot of his great traits. And basically, he also noticed that all life is in competition for resources. So you look at this picture of two bears competing for perhaps a fishing spot, or maybe if there's a female bear nearby. And even this picture of trees, which doesn't look as exciting, they're competing for light and maybe even for water. So the taller tree is going to win, so to say, that competition. So when I say resources, you're thinking things like food. All right, we're thinking things like water, which, in certain parts of the world for certain living things is not easily attainable. Things like shelter, places to live, sleep at night, and albeit this is worded wrong, to reproduce. So obviously within the species, different individuals are competing for the right perhaps to mate with another member of that same species. So we're constantly competing. And individuals that are better fit for their environment, they're the ones who are going to survive and pass the traits. And sadly, the ones who are not fit, they will not survive and they will not pass down their traits. So fitness is a term we're going to start using more and more here. And it's not in relation to working out. Fitness is actually an individual's ability to survive and reproduce, which in the living world really is sadly really all you really need to be able to do. Now, I'm not trying to say that society is not a great thing, but in the living world, if you're going to think about it strictly biologically, a living thing's goal is to survive and reproduce. And if an individual can, that means they are technically favorable. They have the traits that are allowing them to do so. And it's basically our adaptations that allow us to be fit. In other words, the individuals that have the traits that allow them to survive and reproduce, they are considered successful. They have these successful adaptations. And if that's speed, it could be strength, it could be intelligence, it could be size. And that sometimes the smaller ones can survive. Because they survive, they can reproduce. All right, and we're talking about inherited traits now, not acquired, traits that you are born with, not that you pick up in your lifetime. And that all leads to his big theory of natural selection, which basically is the process that causes evolution. It's the process in which organisms that are better fit for their environment will survive and reproduce and become more common. And then, albeit not his term, it's that concept of survival of the fittest. So what he argued basically is natural selection is what has caused change over time. Giraffes, for instance, have long necks because it's the longer neck giraffes that are surviving and reproducing. Cheetahs are fast because the fastest cheetahs were the ones that are surviving and reproducing. And the slower ones weren't. And there are less slow cheetahs around now because of that. So because of natural selection, population of better fit members, whatever that trait may be, is increasing. And the population of the less fit individuals, the individuals that struggle to survive and reproduce, decrease. And then ultimately over time, if the environment changes, the species must change as well. So if the environment gets colder, then individuals will have to have thicker fur perhaps, or if there's a new prey that migrates into an area, they may have to adapt to be able to hunt that new prey. So here's an example of birdbeak, a study of them, and they noticed that in dry years, the average bird beak increased. And the reason why is because thicker bird beaks made them better capable of cracking nuts and seeds. And because of that, they could survive. And the thinner beaked birds were less likely to survive and reproduce during those dry years. And that's why we saw spikes of beak thickness in the drier years. All right, and he also noticed that in his studies of the finch bird as well on the Galapagos Islands. So what's so controversial about his theory? First and foremost is that it bothers a lot of people that, according to his theory, we all descended from previous extinct species. All right, in other words, even humans descended from something that wasn't human. All right, everything today descended from something that wasn't quite itself. All right, so yes, as evidence strongly suggests, is there was something that wasn't quite human that we can trace our ancestry back to. And even more so is that all species today share common ancestry. All right, so from things that are obviously very similar to each other, but things that are obviously very different. So yeah, all mammals share common ancestry, all animals share common ancestry, but truth be told, is all living things share common ancestry. So we do share a common ancestor, albeit very far back in the past, with things like plants and fungi and even bacteria.